Does catching a bass just make it harder to catch next time? Or could it actually impact fishing on the entire lake? For 20 plus years, scientists studied how aggressive bass are, and whether we're changing how much they eat and their willingness to bite. They followed multiple generations of bass, and measured if fishing pressure changes how they feed, grow, and spawn. Stick around, I'll break down what they found, and how you can use it to catch more fish. So I came across this series of studies, and this is one of the most fascinating studies that I've ever come across, and it's actually 3 of them. It was almost 30 years worth of research. So I'm going to break down what the research says in all 3 of these papers, whether it changes the spawn. Do they spawn less? Do the fish populations get smaller? Do the size of the fish get smaller? Do they bite differently? Do they eat more or less? How does it change? What does fishing pressure do to our lakes? And at the end, I'm going to break down exactly, based on these answers that they give us, how do we use this on our lakes and your lake so we can catch more fish? So all 3 of these studies are peer-reviewed. They were all published. The first one was published in 2007, then 2009, then 2011. It was primarily done where actually I went to school at the University of Illinois, so go Illini there. I was not in the study. I was unfortunately graduated way before this, but it sounds like the study with the research was going on, so I missed out on an opportunity. So I'm going to bounce around on the studies a little bit. All of these were conducted on the same fish and by a lot of the same researchers. The 2009 study is the first one, though, and what they wanted to look at is there an inheritable trait that you pass down, like being redheaded or blonde or blue-eyed or green-eyed? Is that passed down in fish, where some fish are more willing to bite and others are less willing to bite? Now, what they noted was it was well studied in commercial fisheries, especially in ocean fish like salmon and cod, that when they commercially harvest those and they net them, all that fishing pressure, all that commercial fishing was actually changing the size of those fish. The bigger ones are being caught in the nets. The smaller ones were not being caught in the nets. And guess what? The fish basically evolved to be smaller. The difference with the bass versus the salmon and the cod, that's the size. If you're big enough, you get caught in the net. If you're smaller, you don't get caught in the net. With bass, it's more behavior. If they're aggressive, if they're more reckless or more curious, those fish can get caught. And then if people either take them home and clean them, or they die in tournaments or something like that, those fish could be removed. So they wanted to check the behavior and see if it's a trait that's passed down. So to get the fish for this experiment, they started with a small lake in central Illinois called Ridge Lake. They had fishermen from the late 70s up to about 1980 there catch fish out of there as the initial stock for this. Those were just neutral fish. From that point, what they started doing is putting them in small little ponds, controllable ponds, brood ponds like less than an acre up to about 3 acres, and they would clip these fish. So each one would be numbered, and they could track them, and at the end of the season, they would drain the ponds. In the meantime, they would have controlled experiments. They would have intermediate level fishermen. They would control the baits that they could use and the amount of time they could use, and they would fish for the exact amount of time in all these ponds and then record it. Now, they did this basically in 3 sets of experiments where they took, in the first one, they measured how many times these fish were caught. And like I said, they could drain it, so they had clips in all these. They could record it. The fish that were caught 0 times were put into a group called low vulnerability, or LV. Those are fish, like I said, that weren't willing to bite, never caught. They put them in one group. Ones that were caught 4 or more times, they called those high vulnerability. Ones that are really eager and aggressive, they separated those fish out. Now they take these separate ones, the HV, the willing to bite, and the LV, not willing to bite, and they bred them within themselves. So basically fish that weren't willing to bite at all, they took males and females, put those together and spawned them together. And then the ones that were willing to bite 4 or more times, they spawned them together, and they kept these separate. And then they fished for these fish, and then they sorted out again. The ones that rarely bit, they pulled those out and spawned them again. The ones that actively bit out of the active group, they spawned them again. They did that 3 times. So they basically separated them out and bred the really aggressive ones to really aggressive ones. The not willing to bite ones, bred them to each other again. Did this in 3 series of experiments from 1980 up to the mid-90s. So basically, they were trying to breed into the population fish that will not touch a lure and ones that go crazy for it. Now, like I said, these were small ponds. Every fish was tagged, and at the end of the season, they could drain it, so they knew exactly how many times every single fish was caught, and they had identical fishing pressure, identical baits and stuff, so they controlled all those variables. What did they find out? So in this study, what they tested for is heritability. And that just means how likely on a scale from 0 to 1 is something to be passed on. Let's say, for instance, something that's 1 is very highly passed on. Environment and your upbringing has nothing to do with it. Like your blood type is a classic example. That's a 1. Doesn't matter if you grow up rich or poor, in the South or the North. No matter what you eat, lean meat or high-fat diet, your blood type's your blood type. That's a 1. Now, the opposite side of the spectrum is the language you speak. You don't inherit that. You don't have a predisposition. Guess what? It's 100% based on the parents that raise you, all the people around you. That's the language you speak. That's a 0. Your hair color, your eye color, your blood type, stuff like that, that's near a 1. Now, something in the middle that's kind of up for debate, actually your IQ and your athletic ability. You're kind of born with some of it. You're somewhat smart to begin with. You're somewhat athletic. But obviously, on the athletic side, if you start lifting weights and working out since the day you're 1 until the day you're 25, you're probably going to be a better athlete, right? That accounts for some of the variability as well. And same with like smarts. You're born somewhat smart or not, but if you get a lot of good education, a lot of mentors, and read a bunch, that can impact it too. So that's right in the middle. That's about half. So where did willingness to bite show up? Well, it showed up as a 146, which is actually pretty low. Let's say, for instance, left-handedness, or whether you're lefty or righty, that's about a 0.24, 26, somewhere in there, so kind of low like that. But there's sometimes identical twins, that one's a righty, one's a lefty, and as you know, maybe somebody's predisposed to be lefty or righty, but if the parent or the coach puts the bat in the left hand or the right hand, well, that probably influences it as well. But there's a little bit of predisposition, but environment has a lot to do with it as well. So yeah, willingness to bite is a trait and it's inheritable, but it's fairly low, you might say. So not a big deal. But that's with natural selection, if you just leave them to their own. Well, fishing is anything but natural selection. It's kind of artificial selection, right? The ones that are willing to bite, well, those are probably the ones that are going home and getting clean. Those are the ones that are going for a boat ride in a tournament live well. Maybe they don't make it. Maybe they get hooked deep or something like that. They bleed out. By fishing pressure on these fish all the time, we could be actively selecting against the active ones. Those are the ones that get caught and taken out of the system because some are going to not make it. Some are going to die. And then the ones that are willing to bite, the real shy ones, well, they don't get messed with, so maybe they're the only ones that stick around. So what's the research show when you actually keep on selecting for those really aggressive ones or non-aggressive ones? Well, guess what? It's a low inheritable trait, but you can definitely select for it. And this is obviously the most extreme case where you're only breeding the aggressive ones to the aggressive ones and the unaggressive ones to the non-aggressive ones. But look at this chart right here. You can see the P1, those are the initial, that Ridge Lake caught fish, and then the F1, F2, F3, those are the first, second, and third generations. And what you look at on the far right side, that's the ratio of being caught of the high vulnerability to the low vulnerability. You look at in the first year, it's like 42% more for the HV ones. By the time you get to the second generation, it's 73% more. And by the time you get to the third generation, you're talking 2.2 times more likely to get caught, catch rate, than the LV ones. That's a big difference. In 3 generations, they're 2.5 or 2.2 times more vulnerable to being caught. Now, this next chart I'm going to put up here, this shows for each of that first, second, and third generation, the LVs and the HVs, the difference in how long it basically would take to catch 50% of the bass in the pond. And remember, these populations are fairly small in the ponds, but this is how many hours of angling it would take. And you know what, there's less fish in that third one. They actually had a fish kill in that third one, so that the numbers were lower. That's why those numbers are lower. But you look at the first time, it's basically twice the amount of time to catch the less aggressive fish than the high vulnerability ones. By the end of the study, the third generation, it took 3 times as much fishing time versus the low vulnerability ones to catch approximately half the fish in the pond. Now, I'll put up this chart and I'll tell you what, this is what really drives it home. This is where there's no good news, but there's a lot of bad news, okay? This chart here, the top line is when you breed those really aggressive fish to each other, what happens? You notice that curve goes up, but very slightly. Those fish, after three generations, got just a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more willing to bite, but not much. Now that lower curve, the one that has the white circles instead of black ones, if you look at that one, that's the bad news. Those are the LV fish, the ones that aren't aggressive. Look at how it drops off. Those original fish, they both start at the same point. Those aggressive ones, they got a little more willing to bite. The ones that were less aggressive, each generation, it plummeted. I mean, they stopped eating almost totally. They were tough to catch. So basically, the aggressive ones, if you keep them in the system and you keep breeding those together, yeah, the fishing gets a tiny bit better. If they're gone and it's only the less aggressive ones breeding, guess what? The catch rates just plummet. I mean, they go straight into the ground. It gets horrible. Now, the researchers were quick to point out here, this was in controlled conditions. This was the most extreme example. This would never happen in the wild. All the aggressive ones wouldn't be taken out. They wouldn't only spawn with other aggressive ones and stuff. This is kind of the most extreme or worst case, craziest example in a controlled environment. Obviously, it's not going to happen like this in the wild, but it does show that if you take out a lot of the most aggressive ones, it's definitely going to be passed down, and it could definitely have an impact on the fishery. So that was just the first study. Once they figured out that, yeah, this is actually a thing, it's inheritable, they wanted to figure out, well, does it change the fish? Are the fish that are more aggressive, are they bigger? They eat more? They have a different heart rate and different metabolism? Do they spawn differently? Do they spawn better or worse? What's up with these fish? What's the best and worst case scenario? And they dove right into it. So this, in the second study they got into in 2007, this one was published. This one actually measured those highly vulnerable versus a low vulnerable bass, the two different populations, their heart physiology, their post-exercise recovery, so it means after being caught or being chased around, how quickly do they recover? And then also they looked at their parenting skills. What do they act like when they guard a nest? So what they found out was there were definitely some differences between these fish. The more aggressive, those HVs, the ones that get caught more, they actually had a higher resting heart rate. And then the less aggressive ones, their recovery was slower after they were stressed or exercised. They actually recovered slower than what the aggressive ones did. And then when it came to spawning, those highly aggressive ones, they were not only aggressive for fishing, but they were also aggressive guarding the nest. They actually swam around more aggressively. They were more conscientious guarding the bed, and they were also more willing to bite or chase lures on the bed as well. So with the nesting behavior, not only did they show that, but they also showed they did a better job of protecting the nest. Those aggressive fish, the ones easily caught, those ones protected their offspring better, so they had a better chance of their offspring surviving. The other thing they looked at was, since they had that higher resting heart rate, a higher metabolism basically, those aggressive, high-energy fish, the ones willing to bite, they had to eat, they estimated, about 40% more food than the less aggressive ones to maintain body weight. And here's an interesting thing they found out. The fish that were more aggressive, that had that higher metabolism, that they estimated needed 40% more food, well, guess what? The growth rate and the size of these fish, remember I said they tracked them for like 30 years, they found out that both those populations, the less aggressive and more aggressive, their body weight and size stayed the same. So basically, somehow, these aggressive fish were probably eating about 40% more food than their less aggressive buddies. Now, those first two studies are a great baseline, but as fishermen, to me, this is the most important one, and this is where we learn the most here. In a third study published in 2011, they took a look at, okay, there's this trait that they pass down, whether they're aggressive or not, and then there's a difference between the populations of their metabolism and how they guard the nest. But let's take a look at these different populations. How do they feed? Do they eat differently? Do they eat more or less? What's the difference between them? Let's get into this because this affects how you catch them. Now, in the 2011 study, what they looked at was foraging behavior, prey capture performance, and then conversion efficiency. Basically, how do they feed more aggressively, faster, slower? What are they doing there? How effective are they? Are they catching as much fish than the other group? And then finally, how are they metabolizing it? Is it like all of it goes to their belly, or they just burn it all off? So with this part of the experiment, they took those third generation fish, the aggressive, the HVs, and then the non-aggressive LVs. They took 2-year-old fish. They averaged 9.3 inches, and guess what? That's why I moved out of Illinois to Texas, because 2-year-olds down here weigh like 5 pounds. But basically, they separated them, put them in aquariums, and then they put minnows in there with them as well, fathead minnows, and they tested them in 10-minute little feeding sprees. And then they also looked at them over 28 days to see how much they ate. Now, in these little aquariums, it was a single bass that was in there. They would put 5 minnows in at a time. They were starved for 48 hours, so they really had an incentive to eat. And they were left in there for 10 minutes, and the researchers watched exactly how they ate and how much they ate. Then the longer-term test, the 28-day test, basically they gave them a large amount of minnows and just let them eat what they wanted out of that. They didn't watch them every minute on that, but they just wanted to see how much they ate over time, count the number of minnows, and then see how much weight they gained or lost. So let's talk about these little 10-minute binges. Remember, they were starved for 48 hours. They were put in a little tank. 5 minnows were put in there. The LV fish, the less aggressive ones, the one that wouldn't bite, they attempted more strikes. They attempted to eat more times. In those 10 minutes, they attempted almost 3.9 strikes, whereas the aggressive ones, they only struck 2.5 times in that trial. Now, these less aggressive fish, they actually end up, because they struck more, they actually consume more, but they also rejected more. That means they got them in the mouth, but then they spit those minnows back out and didn't eat them. The high vulnerability fish, or those really aggressive ones, they didn't make as many attempts, but their success ratio when they decided to was much higher on that, and they rejected, once they got it in the mouth, they didn't reject many. If they got it in the mouth, they were going to eat it. And like I said, with the rejection, the less aggressive fish, they spit back out a minnow basically almost 1 time per trial, 0.85, whereas the aggressive ones, it was only 0.2 per trial, so they were eating, like I said, they pretty much, if they got in the mouth, they were going to eat it. Now, in terms of conversion efficiency, like I said, that's the difference between some skinny buddies that you have. They eat all day, every day, and never gain a pound. People like me, I eat one cheat thing on a diet, and I gain 10 pounds, 4 pounds just by looking at it. Well, basically, those less aggressive fish, they ate less over that course of 28 days, but they were more efficient. They're like me. They eat just a little bit, but they put that weight on. And remember from that other study that they end up being about the same weight. So basically, even though the less aggressive ones eat less, they still end up being about the same size. So at this point, you're probably saying, well, those less aggressive ones, it's weird. They actually struck more in those trials. They struck more often, but they were more cautious, right? They struck more often. They captured more prey, but then they were spitting them back out. So basically, they were kind of less aggressive, whereas the ones that, the more aggressive fish, they didn't strike as often, but when they did, it was a full commitment. So it's basically the difference between that bait, when you see one in live scope that just follows it and nips at it, or the ones when you pitch in, you feel a bite and you set the hook and your pinchers are off the trailer of your jig or something because it just barely mouthed it. That sounds like what these less aggressive ones are doing. They're still willing to bite, but they're just nipping at it, and they're kind of trying to figure out, is it food or not? Whereas the aggressive ones, when they decide to commit, boom, they're going to get it. And the nice thing is, remember, because of their higher metabolism, they actually have to eat more. So over the course of the study, they're eating more. They have to eat more just to maintain their body weight. So they're more aggressive, they're more committed to it, and they're just eating more. All right, so what's this mean to our fishing? Now that we kind of have that result that, yeah, as fishermen, we understand there are more aggressive fish out there. They're just going to smash baits, and they have to eat more. They're on the run, and some of these lakes that we know are just pressured and tougher, well, this kind of explains it. They're just tougher to get to bite. They don't have to eat as much, and they're just less committed when they do it. So how do you catch them in these pressured lakes? Because that's, for a lot of us, either tournaments or that's our home lake. How do you do it? The first one, obviously, pressured fish, they've showed they just don't bite as often. They're not as willing to bite. To me, that tells you one thing. There are times where you have an advantage on pressured lakes, and that's when fish are either grouped up, they're out deep or something, they're competing with each other, summertime ledge fishing or something, and then also those famous periods that we love to fish right before the front comes in, first light and last light on pressured lakes. Obviously, those are key windows, and they're super important. If you're going to fish a pressured lake, that's the time to be out there. Now, here's another takeaway I got from the study. You remember how it showed that the less aggressive fish, the pressured ones, how those ones were more apt to reject prey, to spit it back out on a pretty regular basis? To me, that shows you that scent and flavor, this is probably where on those pressured lakes that really comes into play. I love to use the max scent. That actually puts the scent out in the water, and then any of the power bait or the max scent, when they actually mouth it, it tastes like food. Soft plastics, obviously it feels like food too. It gives you an extra second, whereas hard baits and stuff, yeah, they'll snap at a jerk bait or something. You can get to react, and crankbaits and stuff. but that soft bait, it gives you an extra second, and especially with that scent and flavor, I think that's where it really plays on these pressured lakes. And then lastly, I'll put up 3 videos at the end here. These are based on other research, and I think they show how you can catch pressured fish as well. They worked for me in the past, and the research kind of backs it up. The first one is muddy water. Research shows the fish are less selective there, and I've seen that myself. Muddy water just makes it easier to catch fish, especially on bright sunny days. The second one, I think this is really interesting. Studies show that vertically dropping baits, fish don't seem to remember those quite as well as horizontally moving ones. And guess what? What's the first thing they shut off on? Moving baits. But then the Senko, the wacky worm, the fluke, all that stuff just slowly falling down. They'll still eat that in a tough day. Check out that video. And then finally, there was some research done. Talks about how bass approach prey. And especially with finesse baits, I think slow is the way we always think is the way to go. But actually what triggers them with tiny baits so they can actually see it and they close in might surprise you. So check out these videos on muddy water, on vertical falling baits, and also on how bass strike and approach baits. Or just look at my whole playlist on science-based videos. I think that'll help you catch a few more of those pressured fish and get them back, those big ones, because those are the active ones that eat a lot and are easy to catch, and those dumb ones are the only ones I can catch. See you on the water, guys.